It's 1:29 in the morning on March 26, 2024, and Baltimore is asleep, except for the people who can't afford to sleep. On the Patapsco River, a line of orange work lights glows on the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Up there, a highway crew is patching and protecting the span while traffic thins out. Below them, the water is black, the air is cold, and a container ship the length of 3 football fields is moving under the bridge's shadow. The ship's name is DALI, and in less than a minute, the bridge will be gone. Here's the question that has kept mariners, engineers, and investigators awake since that night. How does a modern ocean-going ship built with redundancies, procedures, and professional crews lose control in a perfectly clear night, in a channel it transits all the time, with pilots on the bridge, and end up taking down one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the US East Coast? Because the headlines make it sound simple: ship loses power, hits bridge. But the real story isn't simple. It's layered, it's fast, and it hinges on a chain of events where every decision, every second, either buys you margin or spends it. And buried inside that chain is a detail so small you could miss it on a walkthrough. The kind of thing that looks harmless right up until it isn't. We're going to follow the night the way it unfolded, minute by minute, because the timeline is the only place this accident tells the truth. But before we get to the moment the lights went out, you need to understand the setting. The Port of Baltimore is a working machine. Deep draft ships come and go through a narrow approach, guided by local pilots, escorted by tugs, threaded between buoys, bridges, and shoals. On paper, it's routine. In practice, it's precision. DALI is a large container ship on a scheduled run. She's built for the open ocean, steady propulsion, predictable hydrodynamics, long distances, where you set up the plant and let it hum. But leaving a port is different. Leaving a port is a series of controlled risks: confined water, traffic, current, and infrastructure that cannot move out of your way. That night, DALI gets underway from Seagirt Marine Terminal with 2 assist tugs in the picture. A pilot team is on the bridge. The crew is at stations. The weather isn't dramatic. Visibility is good. No fog to blame. No squalls. No mystery darkness. If something goes wrong, it won't be hidden behind the sky. In the early part of the transit, everything looks like 1,000 other departures. Steady speed, steady heading, bridge team working, pilots conning, tugboats ready if they're needed. The kind of rhythm that makes everyone believe the system is doing what it was built to do. And then something happens that shouldn't. A sudden loss of electrical power. A blackout hits the ship while she's still in the channel. Think about that. On a ship, electricity isn't comfort, it's control. It's your steering. It's your navigation suite. It's the difference between commanding a moving city of steel and being dragged by it. The first blackout lasts under a minute. Power comes back. Lights return. Systems begin to recover. A minute can feel like nothing on land. On a ship in confined water, a minute is an entire lifetime. Here's the part that matters for the story. When power returns, you don't magically snap back to normal. You have to reestablish control. You have to verify what's running, what's not, what alarms are telling you, what the rudder is doing, and what the propeller is doing. You have to rebuild situational awareness while the ship is still moving, still carrying momentum, still pointed down a channel that does not forgive confusion. The bridge team now has a decision to make. Do you stop and sort it out? Do you anchor? Do you call for more tug assistance? Do you slow to the kind of speed that buys you time to think? Or do you press on, assuming this was a brief disturbance and the plant is stable again? It's an easy question to ask in hindsight. It's a harder question to answer at 1 in the morning while you're responsible for a ship, a schedule, and a safe transit. They continue, and not long after, another blackout. This time, it's worse. The ship loses power again. The plant goes down again, and now the bridge team is watching something every mariner knows in their bones. A big ship without propulsion in confined water doesn't stop. It drifts into whatever physics decides next. In those moments, the channel is no longer a route, it's a funnel. The pilots transmit a distress call. The words are simple, but the meaning is enormous. The ship has lost power, and they need assistance. They ask that traffic be stopped. They know exactly what's ahead. The Francis Scott Key Bridge. On shore, on radios, and in control rooms, those words start a race. Not a race against time in a metaphorical sense. A literal race in seconds. Can you stop vehicles from entering the bridge? Can you clear traffic off the span? Can you get construction workers out of the impact zone? Can you do anything before a moving ship becomes a battering ram? Meanwhile, on the ship, the crew is fighting to restore power. Emergency systems come online. The bridge is working the rudder. Engineers are working on the plant. Orders are coming. Information is moving fast and in fragments. And this is where you need to picture the physics. DALI is not a small vessel that can pivot away at the last second. She is a massive displacement hull with inertia that doesn't care about panic. Even if power returns, even if the engine answers, the question becomes, do you have enough time and enough water to translate that power into a meaningful change in track? Because there's a cruel truth about casualty chains. The moment you realize you're in one is usually the moment the margin is already gone. As the ship approaches the bridge, the crew drops anchor, an emergency move to try to arrest the drift, to create resistance, to pull the ship's head around, to slow the advance. An anchor at speed is violent. It's not a gentle, let's stop here. It's metal and chain slamming into tension against thousands of tons of momentum. It can tear equipment, shock the hull, and still not be enough. The ship keeps coming. In the final seconds, the bridge fills the windscreen. Piers that were background become targets. Radios crackle. Lights flicker. Systems struggle. The noise on board is a mix of alarms, shouted commands, and the deep mechanical sound of a ship trying to wake back up. Then the bow reaches the pier. Impact. And almost immediately, the structure begins to fail. A bridge is designated for traffic and weather. It's not designed to absorb the kinetic energy of a container ship. When a pier is struck with that kind of force, the damage is not cosmetic. It's foundational. Load paths change instantly. Sections lose support. A span that looks solid can become a falling object in seconds. The key bridge collapses into the river. Up on the span, workers performing routine overnight maintenance are suddenly in the middle of an unthinkable scenario. Below, the water is filled with debris. The air fills with dust. The river becomes a rescue scene under broken steel. In the hours that follow, first responders flood the area. Boats search. Divers prepare. Command posts light up. The port is effectively paralyzed. The channel is blocked. The ship sits pinned amid wreckage, a dark outline against the lights of emergency vehicles. And the question everyone asks, out loud or silently, is the same. How did this get this far? Because somewhere between routine departure and bridge collapse, the system failed to stop a ship that never should have been out of control. To answer that, investigators do what investigators always do. They rewind. They pull voyage data. They look at alarm logs, engine control modes, switchboard behavior, and generator performance. They interview the bridge and engine teams. They model the ship's motion. They reconstruct the timeline down to seconds. And the timeline is brutal. It shows a ship that suffered not one, but multiple electrical power losses in a narrow channel. It shows power returning, briefly, and then failing again. It shows a bridge team trying to regain control as the ship continued moving. It shows the distress call going out with only a small window before impact. It shows the attempt to stop traffic. It shows how little time there was to reach the people on the span. Most importantly, it forces a hard question about redundancy. Modern ships are supposed to be built with layers, more than one generator, more than one way to keep essential systems energized, emergency power, procedures for restoring the plant. When one thing fails, another should catch it. That's the theory. But accidents are what happen when theory meets real-world complexity. Investigators began digging into the electrical system, because blackouts don't just appear out of nowhere. They're symptoms. Something triggers them. Something causes protective devices to operate. Something opens a breaker. Something shuts down a plant. That something could be a major casualty: fire, flooding, or catastrophic machinery failure. Or it could be something much smaller that creates a much larger consequence. And here's where we lay out the puzzle without solving it, because the answer is the payoff. On a ship like DALI, electrical power is managed through switchboards, breakers, protective relays, and controls designed to do one thing above all: protect the system. If a fault occurs, the protection acts fast. It isolates, it trips, it prevents fires and equipment destruction. The downside is that protection doesn't take your location into account. A breaker will open just as happily in a shipyard as it will in a tight channel under a bridge. So, investigators asked, what triggered the protections? What made the system decide it had to shut down? They examined the minutes leading up to the first blackout. They looked for warning signs. They looked for abnormal load behavior. They looked for alarms that might have been dismissed as noise. They looked for evidence of maintenance conditions, configuration choices, or prior issues. They asked about generator sharing. They asked about how the ship transitioned between power sources. They asked about how quickly the emergency generator started and what it fed. They asked what systems were available on emergency power and what weren't. They also studied the human side, because even the best equipment can be defeated by expectation. If you've made the same transit dozens of times, you don't expect your ship to go dark. If you've never experienced a blackout in a critical area, you don't feel the risk the same way. And if you've had issues before that didn't turn into catastrophes, your brain learns the wrong lessons. It'll come back. But the sea is full of stories where "it'll come back" turns into "it didn't." The DALI accident is a different setting, but the pattern is the same. You can do a lot of things normally and still end up with no margin when the abnormal shows up. Because in confined water, you don't need a hurricane to have a disaster. You need a few seconds of lost control. Investigators also examined what happened on the bridge during those seconds. What navigation tools were being used? What was the redundancy posture? Were alarms enabled? Was the bridge team relying on certain displays more than others? How quickly did the crew recognize loss of propulsion? How quickly did they transition to emergency actions? Anchors, communications, tug coordination, engine restart procedures? They examined what the pilots knew and when they knew it. They examined how the information moved between the bridge and the engine room. They examined whether the engine control mode and configuration gave the crew the best possible response, or a slower one. And then there's the bridge itself, the infrastructure target that never had a chance to defend itself. Decades earlier, the Key Bridge was designed under different assumptions about ship size, traffic density, and impact risk. A massive container ship losing propulsion in the channel wasn't the design case. The bridge had piers, but not the kind of modern protection systems you see in some newer crossings. Those islands of rock and steel meant to absorb or deflect impact before it reaches the structural support. That doesn't mean the bridge failed. It means the bridge was asked to do something it was never built to do: survive a ship. Now, you might be thinking, if the distress call went out, why weren't the workers cleared? Because the cruelest part of this accident is how little time there was, and how fragmented information can be when a crisis starts with a ship's internal failure. In the moments after the call, there's a scramble to stop traffic. There are emergency notifications. There are radio transmissions. But getting a message to the exact people on the span, at night, in the wind, around equipment with engines and tools running, requires a chain of communication that must work perfectly. And in this case, it didn't. 7 highway workers and an inspector were on the bridge that night. They were there because someone has to maintain infrastructure while the world sleeps. They were not there because anyone expected a ship to come for them. Now, let's circle back to the ship, because this is where the story turns from tragedy to prevention. After the wreckage is cleared enough to begin serious examination, investigators zoom in on the electrical system again. They don't look for a dramatic single failure. They look for a mechanism, an explanation that matches the timing, the symptoms, and the system behavior. And they find it. Not in a headline-worthy explosion, not in a dramatic mechanical break, in a component so ordinary you could stand next to it and feel nothing. The investigation determined that the blackouts were triggered by an electrical fault that caused protective devices to trip, resulting in a loss of power to critical systems and, in turn, loss of propulsion and steering control. But what caused the fault? It wasn't the weather, it wasn't an external collision, it wasn't sabotage, it wasn't a single massive engine casualty. It came down to a problem in the ship's electrical control circuitry, specifically an issue that could create an intermittent connection, the kind of intermittent problem that hides during routine operation, that passes checks, that disappears the moment you open a panel, then returns at the worst possible time. Investigators identified a loose connection associated with a breaker trip unit, an electronic component that senses faults and commands protective action. That loose connection could allow the system to think a fault had occurred, or allow an actual disturbance to propagate in a way that triggered a shutdown. And the detail that makes this so unsettling is this: the looseness was linked to a small band of labeling material that, when installed in that location, could prevent the connection from being properly seated. A tiny piece of identification, something intended to help humans, contributed to a condition that took power away from a ship. A small thing, a huge consequence. Once you know that, the timeline reads differently. The first blackout is no longer a random hiccup, it's a warning shot. The second blackout is no longer bad luck, it's the same vulnerability repeating, this time at the worst possible location. And once the ship went dark in the channel, everything else in the chain became a race against inertia. Restart procedures, emergency generator performance, communications, anchors, traffic control, and the brutal reality that a drifting ship will always win against a fixed structure. That's why this accident matters beyond Baltimore. Because it's easy to build safety systems around big failures, the failures you can imagine. It's harder to build a culture that hunts the small ones that hide. The lessons are uncomfortable, but they're clear. If a ship suffers a blackout in confined water, treat it like a major casualty, until you can prove it isn't. Power came back is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of your investigation, right there on the bridge, while you still have sea room. Electrical protection saves ships every day, but they must be understood, tested, and maintained with the knowledge that they can also take a ship down if the system behaves unexpectedly. Bridge teams need redundancy not as a checkbox, but as an active posture. Tools on, alarms enabled, shared mental models. Because when seconds matter, you don't want to rebuild awareness from scratch. Ports and infrastructure planners have to ask hard questions about what happens when a ship loses control in the worst place. Some bridges and channels can absorb that risk. Some can't. And when they can't, the only true defense is prevention, because there's no brace for impact plan that saves a bridge. And finally, the human cost must remain at the center, because the people on that bridge weren't part of the maritime system. They were just doing their job. The chain didn't give them a warning they could act on. The key bridge fell in seconds. But the decisions that led there, maintenance choices, configuration, response planning, and a tiny detail in an electrical panel were years in the making. If you're looking for one line that captures why this story hit people so hard, it's this: a ship the size of a skyscraper lost power twice because of something small enough to fit under a fingernail. That's not just a maritime tragedy. That's a warning about how modern systems fail. And it's why the only safe assumption in confined water is this: if you lose control, you may not get it back in time. If you want another deep dive into a maritime disaster, leave a comment with the incident you'd like covered next. Subscribe for weekly reconstructions of real casualties and the lessons that prevent the next one. Fair winds and following seas.